What is creation for? What is the purpose of all the seemingly unnecessary, extravagant glory with which God has filled his world? We get glimpses in the Psalms where the writer finds both assurance of God's power and reminders of his own smallness. In the book of Job, where the wonders of God's handiwork give us an answer that no theological treatise could. And in the parables of Jesus, where flowers and foxes and fig trees speak to us of our Father. But how many of us devote entire careers to understanding God's purpose for nature, that glorious, barely explored design to which the Bible so often alludes? Welcome to the BreakPoint Podcast. I'm Shane Morris, and today I'm joined by biologist Dr. Gordon Wilson to talk about a nature documentary with a difference. The Riot and the Dance, Water, is the sequel to 2018's The Riot and the Dance, directed by author and filmmaker N.D. Wilson. Both documentaries are hosted by Dr. Gordon Wilson and inspired by his biology textbook. Dr. Wilson is a professor at New St. Andrews College in Moscow, Idaho, and describes himself as a teacher, a writer, but first, a handcrafted creature among creatures. Dr. Wilson, welcome to the BreakPoint Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Shane. It's great to be here.
Well, this is not what anyone is expecting when they hear Christian nature documentary. And I've seen the first Riot and the Dance, and I'm eagerly awaiting the second. And I've got to say, the production value is just top-notch. It's not what we've come to expect a lot of times from Christian productions. How did you all put together something that just looks so good?
Well, I have to say that Nate doesn't want to do anything second-rate. That's ND, known to his friends and relatives here as Nate. But he just doesn't want to do anything in half measures. And when he started GoPro and hired my son Dane as a cinematographer, he invested in a Red camera and a lot of good editing equipment. And plus, he's a best-selling author, so he's not going to write badly. And he's creative. He's on the cutting edge. So when he asked me to be the narrator, I jumped at the opportunity. He's a shaker and mover, and I like to say it was sort of like he was Gandalf and I was Bilbo. I was very cozy in my hobbit hole, and he whisked me off to great adventures. He doesn't take his cues from half-rate Christian attempts at aesthetics.
So he gave you just a little bit of a nudge out the door.
Yes.
Well, writing at the Gospel Coalition, Brett McCracken describes the almost religious experience many non-religious people feel when they're in nature, whether it's camping or stargazing or surfing, or even just watching the stunning footage in programs like BBC's Planet Earth.
Right.
What do you think it is, Dr. Wilson, in the natural world that prompts this spiritual response, even from people who wouldn't describe themselves as spiritual?
Well, let's look at it. Just give you an analogy. If you're going to an art museum, it's an aesthetic experience, looking at the sculptures and art paintings of various artists, and it's because you're getting a glimpse into who that artist is. So I would say that it's spiritual because you're actually beholding the handiwork of God. You're not. It's awesome to see amazing creative work by engineers. You can be awestruck by an amazing piece of engineering like a bridge or skyscraper or amazing piece of artwork. But in order to get swept up into a spiritual experience, the engineer, the artist, is supernatural. It's just transcends anything that any artist or engineer can do. So I would say that's one of the reasons it's a spiritual experience.
There's a tongue twister for you.
Yeah,
but it's almost like missing the point, right? To look at this artistry and then to ignore the artist and to glorify the art instead. That's reminiscent of something in Scripture, right?
I would say it's not just missing the point. I would go as far as to say it's blasphemy. If you are, the BBC, I've always been a fan of these nature documentaries in the sense that it's just tremendous cinematography, and it brings the beauty and the complexity and the diversity of the living creation right into the comfort of your own home. And yet, all of this has been attributed to random chance, time, matter, energy, mutation, natural selection. And so that's an insult to the God of all creation. That's a flagrant insult. But we sort of take it sitting down. It doesn't, I hope it gets us a little upset that this, they're entrenched in their naturalistic thinking. And so we just think, well, that's just the way they think. But it is blasphemy. They're going to be held accountable to attributing all of this amazing stuff to time, chance, matter, energy. If you were in a museum and say you're looking at a very good work of art, not some modern art type trash, but really, really good, and the artist was standing next to you and you didn't know it, and you were telling your child, this work of art has been produced by just random processes and paint being splattered on the canvas. It'd be sort of an insult to the artist that he's overhearing this little conversation. It's like, how dare you insult my work like that? In the same way, the evolutionist or the naturalistic evolutionist says it is wonderful and glorious, but at the same time, he's saying that it's produced by mindless processes. That's really bad. That is really bad.
So it sounds like, to me, like the void out there in terms of, making sense of nature as more than just a spectacle is part of what inspired you to tackle this project. Is that the case?
Well, making sense of nature, when we started into this, we weren't thinking it's an apologetic movie. There's, great intelligent design, creationist, apologetics, where you're using creation to show and present evidence for the existence of God. And we're not doing that. We are assuming that God created. So it's not apologetic. I don't know if that's the direction of your question. Rather, it's assuming that God created and then showcasing his work and attributing all of that wisdom and omni-intelligence to God. And often when we look at nature, because we've just been sort of numbed by all of the naturalistic documentaries, we just sort of take it for granted. We don't really think in terms of this requires praise. This requires glory and honor. All of it is due his name. That's why the subtitle is a cinematic celebration of creation. We want to celebrate. We want to extol the works of the Lord and bring the beauty and diversity and complexity into people's lives and give credit to where credit is due. I hope that answered.
Absolutely. So the Riot and the Dance, where does this title come from? It sounds like it might be a line of poetry.
Yeah, I named my textbook that. It was a very unorthodox name for a textbook, mostly because I was looking at the creation in light of Scripture. And the riot refers to the fact that the creation has been, since the fall, God cursed the creation. So all creation is subjected to futility. All creation groans, looking for the redemption. So there's a riot that's been introduced. Before, in Genesis 1:29, you see that plants were made for food for both man and animals. But at the fall, then you have carnivory introduced. You have predator-prey relationships, parasite-host relationships, pathogen-host relationships. These are really gnarly things that we've become acclimated to. We think, okay, this is just what nature does. This is the way it's always been. But we have to keep reminding ourselves that this is not the way it's always been. It's a riot. It's broken. It's cursed. Now, at the same time, Romans 1:20 says that God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. So we are without excuse. So even in the midst of all of this brokenness and this groaning that we see in every nature documentary, Christian or not, we see the dance. And the dance is the echoes of the unfallen glories of creation. We still see mutualism, which is, organisms, various creatures benefiting from each other. We see herbivory still. We see courtship dances. We see life cycles that really show, even though it's like looking through a glass darkly, it still shows the glory of the unfallen creation, yet it's been marred by the riot. So you see, that's where the riot and the dance comes from. There's another aspect to the riot that's not just relating to the curse. When we see man-made type stuff, we see a different kind of order and a different kind of beauty. Japanese garden, for example, or even crops and rows. It's just, there's this order that's not as wild. We make that distinction between wild and domestic. And I think that's not just in the behavior of animals, but also in plants and how they're ordered. So when you look at it, say a rainforest, nothing's planted in rows. It's strewn about, lots and lots of diversity. But we see that ecotourism is huge because there's something about the wildness of a particular ecosystem. Coral reef, there's beautiful. Or a tropical rainforest is beautiful, but nothing's in rows. Nothing looks like it's a bonsai tree that's been trimmed and cut into this shape. It's wild, but it's beautiful. Mm. And you see that in Psalm 104 particularly. The psalmist is just writing about the glories of God and his provision for plants and animals and man, water and food and bread and wine. But it's not just talking about the domestics. It's talking about the wild creatures as well. So you're talking about all the revelation that nature gives us, both of God's original intent and of the curse that man introduced into the world. What would you say to someone who hears all this and says that, well, we have the Bible, so we don't really need to look to nature to learn about God? Well, we have the Bible, yes. And we learn about God's moral will, how he has stooped and how he has directed the course of history. We've got the creation, we've got the fall, the curse, the flood, all of this stuff. And we see how God has orchestrated all of history. But at the same time, we know that, as I said in Romans 1:20, we see God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, being understood from what has been made. So it does talk about natural revelation or general revelation, that we get to know God by not only looking at what he wrote, but also through what he made. In the same way, as I said in Riot, the first Riot, which we say sort of in abbreviated fashion, Riot 1, I said that you get to know an artist not only by getting to know him face to face, but also reading everything he wrote, but also looking at what he made. So if you're studying Michelangelo, you study his works of art, and you start to get a sense of who the artist is by looking at the genres and the different media that he uses to do his artwork. And so when we look at leaves and when we look at what plants, flowers, all sorts of animals, you're looking at all of the different genres of artwork that God did. And we like to truncate that often and pick and choose which types of art we think are, just sort of conform to our sense of beauty and aesthetics. And we just say, okay, I like baskets of kittens, but I don't like this other type of creature because it offends me. It's like, I like to see the whole spectrum of God's creativity. And I hope that we start to stretch our own minds and our own sense of what is appropriate by looking at the breadth and depth of God's artwork.
Well, one of my favorite parts of the first film was the sort of apologetic you offer for the beauty of things like bats and centipedes and wasps and spiders and so forth. And this is an ongoing debate I have with my wife where, you know, she says, oh, these other creatures are so beautiful, but I just can't see much beautiful in a wasp or even a cockroach.
Well, yeah.
And I say, it's so beautiful. How can you not see it?
Well, I'm not saying invite them into your homes. There's all sorts of reasons where they've earned a pest status, but at the same time, as an entomologist, I've always been drawn to the creepy crawlies. That's why I like herpetology, reptiles and amphibians, and entomology, which is insects. Yeah, there's a different beauty. Some of it is bizarre. And that's what I meant by different genres. We sort of limit God to the cute and nice and fuzzy, and we go, why are you doing that? You're really sort of shaping your view of God. God is the God of anglerfish. God is the God of goblin sharks. Now, what is he teaching us through those things? You might say, well, all of those things must be the result of the fall. No, I think God made them before the fall. Now, they may have been transformed to some degree since the fall, especially their feeding habits. But, you know, I think before the fall, I don't think everything looked cute in the sense of our senses. I still think, like with looking under the microscope at certain beetle bodies and various other insects, there's an amazing architecture and symmetry. Some of it is, sort of scary. Yeah, some of these science fiction creators probably used some of these creatures and just blew them up large as great monsters in their movies. But same with snakes. I just think snakes are beautiful. But again, we have to, just get a broader palette. Little kid, how kids just want to have the chicken tenders or, mac and cheese. And it's like, well, we need to get past a very limited palette. Now, we've learned to do that with our taste, but we haven't learned to do that with our eyes. Again, centipedes aren't necessarily cute, but I'm not saying they all have to be cute. I'm just saying they're cool.
I agree, heartily.
Yeah.
I hope you're enjoying my interview with Gordon Wilson about the beauty of creation and the upcoming movie, The Riot and the Dance, Water. I wanted to let you know that now is the time to register for our annual Wilberforce weekend, which takes place May 14th through the 17th, just across the river from Washington, D.C. Come and join us as we honor Chinese Christian and pastor Bob Fu for his work on behalf of the persecuted church in China. You'll also meet and hear from Christian thought leaders like Os Guinness, Lee Strobel, Andy Crouch, Obianuju Ekioka, and more. Just come to wilberforceweekend.org for more details and to register. That's wilberforceweekend.org. Well, the goblin shark and the anglerfish are a perfect segue underwater. I'm a huge nature documentary guy, as you might have surmised by now. I used to watch every episode of Marty Stauffer's Wild America.
Oh, wow.
I've never missed anything from BBC Earth.
Right.
And I noticed you're kind of dividing these films in the same way that their team did at the BBC, where they produced Planet Earth and then Blue Planet, and then they did a sequel to each. What was your thinking in saving the aquatic world for the second film?
Boy, well, I wasn't the person deciding which. I think the Earth was just naturally the most simple, and it takes a lot more work and preparation to get ready for water filming. So it just made sense to go with the Earth episode first. It does seem to parallel the Planet Earth and Blue Planet. We're doing water next, but I think it was just more pragmatic. There may have been other reasons, but that's my guess. That would be a good question for Nate.
Well, I'm a Florida boy,
Okay.
And I love to scuba dive. I'm probably happier on a coral reef than just about anywhere else.
Great.
Unless it's looking at an underwater fossil lair, trying to find treasures. Did you get to do any diving for the film?
Yeah.
Okay, where at?
We dove, well, first, that was one of the things we had to get certified. We're pretty landlocked up here in northern Idaho, at least as far as
they give out scuba certifications like candy in Idaho.
Well, we had to go to Hawaii and get certified.
Had to.
What now? Had
to.
Well, yeah, I think you probably get certified up here somewhere. Dane was just saying you can get certified at the University of Idaho pool, but
Fun.
we went to Honolulu and got certified there. So I dove there and Monterey Bay. There was the cameramen also went to other locations. I'm not as flexible as far as the schedule goes, so they were able to film in other spots. We also went to Florida to film manatees and other things, and Everglades.
Very nice.
So, it was great. Starting into this, I'm 58, and so it is definitely an example of teaching an old dog new tricks, but it's been a great adventure, and it's a great bunch of people to do it with.
What's your favorite scene in the film?
Oh, boy. Well, I think diving with sharks was amazing, but I would say more in line with my personality, diving with manatees was better, because I'm more of a manatee.
Manatees are a little more your speed. Although
Yeah.
I did see a video recently of a manatee somewhere in Florida here, just going freakishly fast, much faster than you think a manatee could possibly
that's
go.
Neat.
So yeah,
That's neat.
they can jet when they need to. Is there something? Let's transition here. Is there something that you think the church could be missing about the natural world and creation? And if so, what is that?
Oh, boy. I would say that this sort of segues into the book I just wrote, which sort of dovetails well with Riot and the Dance, and that is A Different Shade of Green. And it's just, the subtitle is A Biblical Approach to Environmentalism and the Dominion Mandate. So I think Christians, because of the fruitiness of the environmental movement in many regards, there's a spectrum, but we often see the extremists where nature is deified and we are the virus and everything that we do is hindering. So we've done a lot of harm, but I think the church has reacted negatively and understandably against the environmental movement because of their extreme views and their extreme and sometimes insane solutions to problems, and often making a big deal out of problems that aren't problems, that often conservatives that are, well, Christians, who are usually very politically conservative, often will react strongly and violently against that, understandably so, but it also puts them in a sort of a weird position of the environmentalist is loving God's creation, all for the wrong reasons, and they're not giving God the credit. But Christians, because they're setting themselves to be the antithesis of that, have distanced themselves away from anything that shows a nice view of, a good, solid view of, I don't like to use the buzzwords, but stewardship, yes. But then you've got two sides of this spectrum. Often Christians will either react in a sort of very hyper-conservative against anything environmental, and so they sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater, or they really, really love nature, which I do, but then they take on board in a very undiscerning way a lot of the secular environmental agenda, which is just, these are two extremes that are just not biblical. We shouldn't just react against everything that the environmentalist holds dear, because The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Therefore, we need to care for it. We need to exercise the dominion mandate in a way that's biblically consistent. And we shouldn't say, oh, well, they love nature, and then I will do everything for nature the way they want me to do it. That is just capitulating to all sorts of eco-zealot nonsense. And so that's why I wrote the book, and I think it ties in well with the movie Riot and the Dance. Does that sort of
sticks
answer?
and weeds? Absolutely, yeah. So the sticks and weeds and varmints on one end, that's one extreme, and then the other is the Mother Earth extreme.
Right.
And you want to avoid both of those.
We need to say, how do we view God's diversity that He made? And so that's where I want to really, in my book, try to develop a biblical theology of how we are to view the creation, and without falling off of either side of the boat.
Well, speaking of a theology of creation, what do you think that we can learn theologically from the watery world? What did God create, the ocean in particular, to teach us?
Well, lots of things. We can learn a lot about, again, His artistry. In 1 Kings 4:33, Solomon teaches. Part of Solomon's wisdom was to talk about plants and animals and birds, reptiles and fish. You see that. And we often just think, well, that's Solomon's wisdom, and so therefore it's just learning sort of moral principles like Aesop's fables. And we see a little bit of that in his Proverbs, like go to the ant, sluggard. But it just says he taught about plants, like the cedar of Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the walls. I think he was teaching basic natural history of these things. Now, we don't have it in writing, but we learn about God's wisdom, and by studying it, we are gaining wisdom from it. It even includes his teachings on plants and animals as part of his wisdom. So anything created, water included, we're learning so much about God's engineering. Remember, it's not just artwork, it's engineering. So there's a whole field called biomimetics. And I think Christians are not on the forefront of these things. Engineers are looking to nature to teach them underwater things as well on how to build better designs. And none of it's patented. God's not, you can learn all of this stuff from creation just at a practical level, but also more at a spiritual level. God, when we study these things, we see that this is how God provides for us. He provides so much food for us in the ocean. And I think it behooves us to know the balance of nature so that we can manage it well and be good stewards of it. The ocean produces so much food for so many people in terms of seafood, but also it produces probably anywhere from 50 to 80% of the world's oxygen, depending on which source you pick. But at least 50% of the world's oxygen that we use to breathe is from the ocean plankton, the phytoplankton, which are tiny unicellular plants. And so just being full of gratitude for God's amazing creation. We just take a lot of this stuff for granted. But what keeps us alive is God's creation. It's our life support system. So when you think about, okay, all of this stuff is our life support system, that to me gives us great reason to be full of gratitude to God.
One of the things that strikes me entering the watery world, while scuba diving, is the way it's cut off from us, or has been for most of human history. Mm-hmm. In other words, this was inaccessible to us. We lack the biological equipment to get down there and not just breathe, but even see. Our eyes can't handle the refraction of the light. It bends the light, so we can't see. It's blurry. But we have these inventions now that within the last couple of generations have enabled us to see things that God was never exalted for, at least not specifically before.
Yeah.
And we can now praise him for those things.
We can. And in the Bible, it just talks of, in Job, you read some aquatic, semi-aquatic creature, behemoth, leviathan. They had to usually be big for people pre-scuba to really, really appreciate the majesty of these creatures. So just sort of recap would be just gratitude for being the life support system it is, also for being a source of innovation by just looking at the creation and being able to copy it for our own uses, as well as just we can't undervalue the aesthetic. We often think in terms of just practical utilitarian values, and we need to realize that just walking on the beach and hearing the swish of the waves is just so wonderful and so relaxing. People like to go to the ocean for all sorts of things from a recreation. Think of that word, recreate. When you go scuba diving in a coral reef, it's a recreation. It's recreating you in the sense of just giving you peace and joy to behold all of the manifest glories of God underwater. That, like you said, were just not even available for us to see until just recently, thanks to Jacques Cousteau and the invention of scuba.
Well, I have this belief that time and nature, regardless of where you are, will one day be recognized as an essential nutrient. It's not just something you can, live without on a day-to-day basis,
right,
and still be a healthy, well-adjusted human being. How can someone who thinks they're deficient in that vital nutrient get started not just learning about God through his creation, but even accessing it? I mean, the obvious answer is go outside, but
a lot of kids might look at Riot and the Dance, go, "Oh, this is cool, this is exotic, and I can never, I've just got this, I'm in a suburbia and I've got this backyard." It's like, there is so much just outside your front door, your back door. Some have more than others. Some might have a gully, some might have a creek nearby, some might have a pond, have access to a little bit more nature. But I think that parents of young kids, for sure the kids are less, the concrete hasn't hardened with them. And kids have an innate most kids have an innate curiosity of nature. They like to go out and muck around. And I think we need to encourage that and give our children opportunity to get out there and explore, catch frogs and snakes and, rear tadpoles. That is half of it right there, is just let them have at it. If we make it all academic and here, this is your recommended daily allowance of biology, and we make it all dry and stuffy and ugly, and it's all work-related rather than just an exploring. As a biology professor, I can work with someone who's just really immersed themselves in nature. Even if they don't really understand any of it from a biological perspective, I've got stuff to work with because they've got experience. I can say, have you ever ripped open a log and seen, they were looking for salamanders or something, and you ripped open a log and seen all this yellow fuzz or white fuzz, and I get a bunch of blank stares. See, what I want to do is make connections. When I'm teaching something, I want to make connections with their own experience and give glory to God for it. But when the closest exposure they have to a mushroom is the Super Mario Brothers, this is a depauperate situation where kids are not enjoying the beauties of creation. So I would recommend, of course, watching Riot and the Dance, but don't stop there. They need to get out and experience it for themselves, and it can be their backyard. So seeing things up close for yourself in some ways may not be as exotic as something you saw in the film, but it's your experience, your firsthand experience.
Yeah, the film is called The Riot and the Dance. I've been speaking with Dr. Gordon Wilson here who is the host and narrator of the film. The film is directed by N.D. Wilson, or Nate Wilson.
My nephew.
A relative of yours, I understand, yeah. No, Dr. Wilson, tell us when the movie comes out and how our audience can see it.
The movie comes out worldwide March 6th. It's pay-per-view. So a lot of people who couldn't see it last time because it was only in select theaters, now they can bring it to wherever they are. But they have to do it. And there's 2 packages. I would highly recommend the group package. So you can go to riotandthedance.com, and it gives you a choice of a family package or a group fundraiser package. Now, the group fundraiser, I just think is great. You get a license to show it anytime for as much as you want between March 6th and May 5th. And you're licensed to get the Blu-ray, and you can have a church group or any kind of group that you can pull together, and that license is just $195. Now you can charge for it for a fundraiser and really make money on this. If you've got a venue for showing it with all the AV stuff, particularly churches, if you have to rent a theater, then maybe not as much profit. But if you can do it for a nonprofit situation, or you can charge. And that's a really cheap price. And if you get it before February 14th, you get other merch that comes along with it. That's part of the package. So that group fundraiser license, I really recommend that. Or you can still get for a family view.
The Riot and the Dance Water.
Yeah, and it's riotandthedance.com.
Riotandthedance.com. And the release date is
March 6th. And again, it has those 2 different pay-per-view options, one family, one's group. And I highly recommend it to bring it wherever you are in the world, and invite your family, friends, church, youth group, whatever it is. And it's a great deal.
Well, Dr. Wilson, it's been tremendous. Thanks for having this conversation, and thanks for joining me today on the BreakPoint Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Shane.
Thanks for listening to the BreakPoint Podcast. Be sure to learn how you, your family, and your church can view the Riot and the Dance Water. Simply go to riotandthedance.com. That's riotandthedance.com. And please come to wilberforceweekend.org to register for our annual Wilberforce Weekend in May. It'll be a great weekend with powerful speakers. That's wilberforceweekend.org. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.